Board games that failed before their time. Now, this example that I'm going to push out there, one could say it's not really a board game because it doesn't have a board. You can play it on any play area. But I could also counter and say, well, it is a board game in spirit, and it's really an amazing example of innovation, an interesting concept, but one that, while ahead of its time, is maybe a little too radical. And then, of course, following up in the comments, your example of titles. Disc Wars. Warhammer Fantasy Disc Wars. Now, I'm aware that there was a kind of generic version of Disc Wars before the Fantasy Flight Warhammer Fantasy, but this is kind of the pinnacle, the zenith for me. So Disc Wars was an interesting take in that it was a mass combat fantasy game. Warhammer Fantasy, before Games Workshop completely destroyed and nuked it and turned it into Age of Sigmar, Warhammer Fantasy is kind of an old world D&D-esque fantasy game where you would build massive armies 1-to-1. So if you have a group of knights, 30 knights, you had 30 models on the table, and you have war machines, and you have fantastic monsters and dragons and amazing terrain. Like truly, it was mass scale battles. And Warhammer Fantasy, while it was exciting, I still have my Goblin army. I refused to convert it over to Age of Sigmar. The challenges with it were, first of all, playtime, and maybe that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. It would take a long time to play. Set up, break down, table space. But the bigger aspect was, of course, and this is part of the hobby. I know we're talking about miniature war games here, but this is kind of the framework for Disc Wars and board games. That part of the hobby was building, painting, converting, collecting these massive, massive armies. But that's a pretty big price of entry. And it was a lot of fun. It was a fun game. I mean, who wouldn't want to command fantastic armies and war machines and really explore and play that part of the game? So along comes Disc Wars, where set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, Fantasy Flight was working with Games Workshop at the time to produce a number of GW non-miniature titles. So they were kind of allowed to do whatever they want in the Warhammer Fantasy, Warhammer 40K universe. Talisman, we saw this with Dungeon Quest, other old titles owned by Games Workshop. And they could include some tokens and figures, but no miniatures. So Disc Wars was an interesting adaptation where this mass combat scale game, the units, so if you had a unit of 50 pikemen, it was literally a disc. Literally a disc. And the discs were different sizes. That's important for the game. They were different sizes based on the unit size, whether it was a monstrous creature or a smaller unit. Had a picture, had some great artwork, had some stats. The discs were your blocks of troops, literally. So you would lay out on the table these four kind of boundary markers. We would always play it on like a nice kind of wargaming grass mat, but you could play it anywhere. You lay out these boundaries. There was printed cardboard terrain that represented forests and other areas that you'd put out. And then you would literally build your army from these discs. And there was some suggestions for scenarios and ways to select units that you want. The mechanics of the game, you would activate units by flipping the disc, literally side over side, flipping the disc across the table to move it. And if your disc contacted and overlapped another disc, you were attacking. And then you went into combat, and there was some dice and powers that you can use, kind of the usual Fantasy Flight stuff. The game was amazing because played extremely fast. You got the feeling, the full feeling, not a stripped down feeling. You got the full feeling of a mass combat type game in a playable experience, a fast experience, 30, 45 minutes playing this game. You had the visuals. The artwork was great. The discs, yeah, it's 2-dimension versus 3 dimensions. It's not miniatures, but they looked awesome on the table and the various units as you moved and you figured things out. It really captured the imagination. Footprint was nothing. What I mean by that is literally it was a small box with these discs, terrain, dice, some tokens, and the boundary markers. That's it. You show up to play this war game / board game, slash hybrid, and everything fit. What was interesting was they released expansions, the various armies. You had dwarves, you had chaos. So it was easy to kind of assemble 5 or 6 different Disc War armies and play the game. Now, eventually, of course, Games Workshop didn't renew those licenses, squashed those licenses, didn't continue that association with Fantasy Flight. At the time, they stopped Talisman, they stopped Disc Wars, they stopped a number of other titles, and of course, recently have pushed those out to other studios to produce. But Disc Wars was just there and kind of vanished. It's kind of like Wiz War back in the day. Wiz War vanished for a long, long time. And then it was able to come back in a re-imaged format. But Disc Wars has always kind of captured an interesting place in my heart because I love mass combat, mass scale games, super small footprint, really customizable, innovative and interesting to play by flipping discs and getting them to overlap and figuring that movement piece out. And something that visually looks good but fits in a box ready to play. Scaling, transforming, and taking a a war game experience and transferring it out to a board game and doing it with innovation and quick play. That was a concept way before its time. So, turning it over to you guys in the comments, my fellow board gaming enthusiasts. Has anyone played Disc Wars? Bonus points for the original Disc Wars. But in exploring that, what are some other titles that just, you had a chance to play them, you had a chance to see them, and you're like, this is something innovative. This is something really interesting. And maybe you bought into it, maybe you didn't, and then just like that, it vanished.